Hercule Poirot and the Affair of the Fatal Photograph. Chapter 1. A Most Unusual Crime. The fog curled lazily through the streets of London, casting an eerie glow beneath the gas lamps. Inside the opulent Rosewood Hotel, a distinguished crowd had gathered for an exclusive charity gala. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved silently through the ballroom, silver trays glinting under the chandeliers. It was an evening of elegance, of whispered secrets behind gloved hands, and of carefully measured smiles that concealed far more than they revealed. At precisely 10:10, a blood-curdling scream shattered the refined air. The music faltered, the violinist's bow scraping a discordant note. All eyes turned towards the grand staircase, where Lady Margaret Stanwix stood, one gloved hand pressed to her throat. Her eyes were wide with horror, fixed upon the lifeless figure sprawled at the foot of the stairs. The victim, Mr. Alastair Kent, lay motionless, his once impeccable evening suit now dishevelled. A single damning detail caught everyone's attention. Clutched tightly in his left hand was a photograph, its corners slightly crumpled, its image obscured. Inspector Harold Japp of Scotland Yard arrived within the hour, his brow furrowed in consternation. He examined the body and the small, elegant camera found beside it. "A most peculiar business," he muttered. "No sign of struggle, no visible wounds. The man simply collapsed." "Not simply, mon ami," came a calm, precise voice. All heads turned as Hercule Poirot stepped forward, his moustache immaculately groomed, his eyes twinkling with sharp intelligence. He inclined his head slightly, surveying the scene with a keen, knowing gaze. "The body tells a story, Inspector," Poirot mused, "and I believe our Mr. Kent knew something that cost him his life." Japp huffed. "Well, we'll soon see. The coroner's report will tell us the cause of death." "Ah, but it is not the coroner who will solve this mystery, mon cher Japp," Poirot said, his fingers steepled. "It is the human mind, and that—" He gestured toward the photograph still clenched in the dead man's grasp. "That may be the key to everything." The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside the fog thickened, as if the very city itself conspired to hide the secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The Rosewood Hotel was in chaos by the time Hercule Poirot took his place near the grand staircase, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The crowd, once composed of glittering socialites, had transformed into a sea of nervous whispers and anxious glances. Every conversation seemed to stop abruptly the moment Poirot entered the room. His presence, as commanding as it was subtle, the subtle tick of his pocket watch, was the only sound that dared to disrupt the heavy silence. Inspector Japp stood nearby, speaking in low tones with a uniformed officer who was scribbling in a notebook. Poirot moved past them without a word, his eyes narrowing as he passed the cluster of guests who had gathered to view the crime scene. The photograph, still clenched in Kent's lifeless hand, was the focal point of the entire room. It held a silent, damning power, as if the truth was hidden within its delicate frame. "Poirot," Japp finally said, his voice breaking the stillness. "I'm afraid this is a most unusual case. The man's dead, and yet no one can explain how. Why? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Perhaps you could offer some insight." Poirot gave a single nod, his movements measured, his sharp gaze scanning the faces around the room. Each guest, each member of this high society gathering was under scrutiny. There was no detail too small to escape his notice. "Mon ami," Poirot replied softly, "I do not yet know the how or the why, but I know this much. Someone here knows the truth, and we shall uncover it step by step." The first of the suspects to be questioned was Lady Margaret Stanwyck, the woman who had found the body. Her pale face betrayed the shock of the moment, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. Poirot noticed the tremor in her hand as she clutched a glass of champagne, though she made no effort to conceal it. "Lady Margaret," Poirot began, his voice like silk, "you discovered the body. Tell me, what were you doing before you found Mr. Kent?" She swallowed nervously, glancing briefly at her husband, Lord Edward Stanwyck, who stood in the corner, his posture stiff and defensive. I had stepped away from the crowd for a moment, Monsieur Poirot. I went to fetch some air by the balcony, and when I returned, I saw him, Alistair Kent, lying there at the foot of the stairs." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his fingers twitching as he processed the details. He studied her expression carefully, watching for the faintest signs of deception. Lady Margaret's story seemed plausible enough, yet something about her manner made him uneasy. There was too much tension in her voice, too much nervousness in the way she clutched her glass. "Did you see anyone else near the stairs?" Poirot pressed, his eyes fixed on her face. Lady Margaret hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the other guests before returning to Poirot. No, I did not, but I heard voices just before I stepped inside. It sounded like an argument." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "An argument? Between whom?" She shook her head, her face reddening. I don't know. It was too faint to make out, but I'm certain someone was upset." Poirot's mind was already working, forming a theory, but he said nothing more. He thanked Lady Margaret and gestured toward the next suspect, a tall man with sharp features and a commanding presence, Lord Edward Stanwyck. Lord Stanwyck, his face flushed with what could either be indignation or guilt, stood with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He met Poirot's gaze without flinching, though there was an air of guardedness about him. Poirot's sharp eyes took in every detail, from the way Lord Stanwyck held his chin high to the faint twitch at the corner of his lips. The man was hiding something. Of that Poirot was certain. "Lord Stanwyck," Poirot began, his voice quiet but firm, "you were with your wife when she found the body, yes? What were you doing before the discovery?" Lord Stanwyck's gaze shifted, just for a moment, toward Lady Margaret, who stood nearby, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "I was speaking with Mr. Kent," he said, his voice tight. "We had a brief conversation about the charity auction. Nothing of importance, I assure you." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And was Mr. Kent in good health?" he asked, his tone casual, as though probing for something insignificant. Lord Stanwyck's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Yes, of course. Why do you ask?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "I merely wish to understand the context. You See, Monsieur Stanwick, we are dealing with a puzzle, and it is important to consider every possibility, no matter how small." Stanwick did not respond immediately, but Poirot could feel the tension thickening in the air. There was something off about his demeanour, something that did not quite match the story he was telling. Before Poirot could probe further, the next suspect approached, Miss Evangeline Darnell, a striking woman with dark, almost mesmerizing eyes. She had been standing by the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture perfect in every way. But as she stepped forward, Poirot saw the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Miss Darnell," Poirot began, studying her closely. "You were acquainted with Mr. Kent, yes?" She nodded, her lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, we were friends, though I suppose one could say we were more than that at one time." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, an old flame, perhaps," he suggested gently. Miss Darnell's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Poirot had struck a chord. "Not exactly," she said coolly, "but we did have a connection. We often spoke of art, of the future, of things that no one else seemed to care about." "Was Mr. Kent worried about anything recently?" Poirot asked. "Was there something weighing on his mind?" Miss Darnell's eyes darkened. "He was a man full of secrets, Monsieur Poirot, but he did not share them with me. I wish he had in retrospect." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And what of the photograph?" he asked, his tone casual but insistent. "Did you know of it?" At the mention of the photograph, Miss Darnell's composure faltered ever so slightly. "No, I had no idea about the photograph," she replied quickly, her voice rising slightly with the defence. "I don't even know how it ended up in his hand." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Ah, but that is a mystery, is it not?" he murmured. Miss Darnell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Indeed," she replied stiffly, her eyes glancing away from him. "But I know nothing about it." Poirot studied her for another moment before moving on. As he did, he took note of the way her fingers were trembling slightly around her glass, almost imperceptible, but noticeable to his trained eye. She was hiding something. The room grew colder, the atmosphere thick with suspicion, as Poirot continued his examination of the suspects. He moved methodically through the crowd, questioning each person in turn. A young couple who had been lingering near the entrance, an older man with an impeccable air of dignity. Each had something to hide, though none could yet be definitively linked to the crime. As Poirot completed his round of questioning, he could feel the web of deception closing in around him. Each response, each gesture, seemed calculated to mislead. But Poirot was no ordinary detective. He had learned long ago that the smallest inconsistency could reveal the deepest truth. Standing in the centre of the room, he allowed the gathered suspects to fall into silence, their eyes fixed on him. He studied each of them carefully, allowing the weight of his gaze to press upon them. This was a game of minds, and Poirot was ready to play. But first he would need more than what had been said. He would need to see the truth with his own eyes. The photograph, that simple piece of paper, was the key, and as he prepared to examine it in greater detail, he knew one thing for certain. The truth was closer than any of them realized. Chapter 3. the first false lead. The following morning, the Rosewood Hotel was almost eerily silent. The hustle and bustle of its usual high society clientele had been replaced with the low hum of anticipation. News of the tragic death of Alistair Kent had spread quickly, and it seemed that everyone, from the hotel staff to the most distinguished guests, was waiting for some resolution. A resolution that, as of yet, eluded Hercule Poirot. Poirot stood in the hotel's small library, his attention divided between his thoughts and the documents in front of him. The photograph, still clasped in Kent's lifeless hand, had been taken to the police station for closer inspection. In the meantime, Poirot meticulously re-examined his notes on each of the suspects. The clues were slowly forming a pattern, but something still felt amiss. It was as though there were a thread just out of reach, one that, if pulled, would unravel the entire mystery. "Mon ami," said Inspector Japp, his voice cutting through the silence as he entered the room. "I have good news and bad news." Poirot did not look up immediately. His eyes were fixed on a piece of paper, the ink blotting slightly, from where he had written his observations. "Ah, Japp," he replied, still concentrating on his notes. "I would prefer the bad news first, so that I may prepare myself for the good." Japp chuckled dryly. "Well, the bad news is that we have a suspect, Lord Edward Stanwick. He has a rather suspicious alibi and a motive, so the local authorities are inclined to consider him guilty. The good news is that I still have my doubts." Poirot's eyes snapped up to meet Japp's, the glint of sharp intellect flashing behind them. "Lord Stanwick, you say?" he mused. "Yes, I can understand why they would think him a likely candidate, but I find it hard to believe that he is the one who killed Kent." "I thought you might say that," Japp replied. "But there's more. It seems there was a disagreement between Kent and Lord Stanwick just a few hours before the murder. They were seen arguing near the balcony, and witnesses confirm that it became quite heated. We have yet to uncover exactly what the argument was about, but it's enough to make the authorities suspicious." Poirot folded his hands together, his mind already sifting through the possibilities. "An argument, yes. That does not surprise me. People often quarrel in these circles over matters both trivial and significant. And yet it is not enough to condemn a man." Japp looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Poirot stood up, walking over to a small cabinet where a decanter of whisky sat. He poured himself a small glass and swirled it thoughtfully. "You see, my friend, people lie, yes, but it is not their words that give them away. It is their actions. It is their behaviour, their reactions, their very mannerisms. When someone is guilty, they are rarely as calm as they appear. The guilty party cannot help but reveal themselves in the smallest ways." Japp raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying Lord Stanwick isn't guilty? But he's the only one with a clear motive." Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a well-played game. "Ah, Japp, I do not dismiss motives so easily. But I have already spoken with Lord Stanwick, and I am not convinced. He is hiding something, yes, but I do not believe that his guilt is so easily found." Japp exhaled slowly, clearly frustrated by Poirot's unshakable calm. "So, who do you think did it then?" Poirot paused for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I do not yet know. But I have a feeling that the answer is closer than we think. We must look beyond what is presented to us and examine the finer details. There is something here, a contradiction, a hidden motive that will reveal itself in time. The investigation continued throughout the day, with Poirot observing his suspects from afar, noting the smallest shifts in their behaviour. Yet, despite his sharp eye for detail, nothing seemed to bring him closer to the truth. As evening fell, Poirot returned to the scene of the crime, where the hotel had set up a temporary investigation room. Japp was waiting for him, his face grim. He handed Poirot a stack of papers. "Well, Poirot, we've found something. It seems that we were right to consider Lord Stanwick a suspect. A private investigator hired by Kent was looking into him. Knew something about Lord Stanwick's past, something that could destroy him." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, a secret past," he said slowly, as though testing the words. "That does explain some of his behaviour. But I still do not believe that Lord Stanwick is the murderer. No, there is something more to this." Japp threw up his hands in exasperation. "I'm telling you, Poirot, we're on the right track. Stanwick has the means, the motive, and the opportunity. We'll have him arrested tonight." Poirot placed a hand on Japp's arm, his demeanour as calm and collected as ever. "You are jumping ahead, mon ami. You see, the truth is often obscured by the first piece of evidence we find. We must look for the second piece, the one that contradicts the first." Japp stared at him. "What do you mean?" Poirot said, his voice low and precise. "The photograph." Poirot had spent the better part of the afternoon examining the photograph that had been found with Kent's body. His initial thoughts had been that it was simply a piece of evidence, a clue like any other. But as he studied it more closely, something began to nag at him. It was not just any photograph. It was a portrait of Lord Stanwick, but not in the way one would expect. The image was taken from a distance, almost as though it were a candid shot. There was a certain intimacy to the photograph, an angle that suggested the photographer had been close to the subject, perhaps even someone who knew Lord Stanwick well. Poirot returned to the photograph, his gaze fixing on it with the intensity of a hawk. He examined the fine details, the texture of the paper, the faint shadow that seemed to distort the image ever so slightly. It was clear that this photograph had been tampered with. There was something off about it, something that suggested it had been altered after it was taken. "I knew it," Poirot muttered to himself, more to reassure his own mind than to make an announcement. He turned to Japp, who had been watching him in silence. "The photograph, my friend, is the key to understanding this case." Japp looked at him, confused. "But what does it mean?" Poirot sighed and placed the photograph down carefully on the table. "What it means, mon ami, is that we have been looking in the wrong direction. The photograph does not simply incriminate Lord Stanwick, it implicates someone else entirely." As Poirot spoke, a wave of realization washed over him. The photograph, which had seemed like a straightforward piece of evidence, was in fact a clever piece of misdirection. Someone had deliberately framed Lord Stanwick by placing this photograph with the body. But why? Who stood to gain from Kent's death? And how was the photograph connected to the crime? Poirot's mind raced. There were many unanswered questions, but now One thing was clear. The first lead had been a false one. Lord Stanwick was not the murderer. The real culprit had played a dangerous game, one that Poirot was now determined to unravel. "You see, Jap," Poirot said with a small smile, "the answer lies not in the man with the most obvious motive, but in the one who has the most to hide. We must look beyond the surface and question what we think we know. The game is far from over." Jap looked at Poirot, his scepticism slowly beginning to fade. "So, who do you think did it?" Poirot stood, his posture as straight as ever, and his eyes glinting with that characteristic intensity. "I do not yet know. But soon, mon ami, very soon we shall find the truth, and when we do, the puzzle will be complete." Chapter 4. The Psychological Game. The days seemed to stretch on as Hercule Poirot continued his investigation into the murder of Alistair Kent. His reputation as a brilliant detective preceded him, but even Poirot himself was beginning to feel the weight of the case. As he and Inspector Japp dug deeper into the lives of the suspects, one thing became increasingly clear. They were all hiding something. Every question posed, every answer given, every fleeting glance exchanged among them, it all contributed to the intricate web of deception Poirot was carefully unravelling. But the truth still remained elusive. That afternoon, Poirot returned to the Rosewood Hotel, where he was to meet with Lord Edward Stanwick once again. After his earlier interview, Poirot had been left with the unsettling feeling that something was not quite right. Lord Stanwick, though an imposing figure, had been too composed, too carefully practised in his responses. It was almost as if the man had rehearsed the conversation in his mind long before Poirot had arrived. There was no evidence, no clear motive, but Poirot trusted his instincts. Stanwick was hiding something. Upon his arrival, Poirot was shown into the grand study of Lord Stanwick's private suite. The room was lined with antique bookshelves, each filled with volumes of history, philosophy and art. The light filtering through the grand windows cast long shadows on the floor, and the air smelled faintly of tobacco and wood polish. Lord Stanwick stood by the fireplace, his figure silhouetted against the flickering flames. He turned as Poirot entered, a practised smile appearing on his face. "Ah, monsieur." "Poirot?" Lord Stanwick greeted him with a stiff bow. "I trust you are making progress with your investigation." Poirot smiled politely, though his mind was already at work, observing. "Progress indeed, my lord. But I must confess, I find myself still uncertain about a few things. Perhaps you could help me clarify them." Stanwick's gaze flickered, betraying the smallest moment of tension, but it passed so quickly that Poirot almost missed it. "Of course. Ask me anything, Monsieur Poirot. I shall do my best to assist you." Poirot nodded and took a seat, his eyes never leaving Stanwick's face. He had learned much from his earlier interview with the man, but he needed more, a crack in the seemingly impenetrable facade. "I am curious, mon ami, about the argument you had with Mr. Kent the day of his death. What was it that prompted such heated words?" Stanwick's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Poirot saw the slightest tightening of his jaw. "Mr. Kent and I had a difference of opinion," Stanwick replied smoothly. "Nothing more than that. I would not read too much into it." Poirot leaned forward slightly. A difference of opinion? Ah, mon ami, I believe you are a man of intellect, and I find it difficult to believe that such a man would be driven to argue, without deeper motivation. I believe there was something more behind it. Something personal, perhaps. For a long moment, Stanwick did not respond, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Poirot waited patiently, his gaze unwavering. Finally, Lord Stanwick spoke again, though his tone had shifted slightly, as if he had decided to play along with Poirot's game. "You are quite perceptive, Monsieur Poirot," Stanwick said, his voice taking on an almost amused quality. "But I assure you, I have no reason to harm Mr. Kent. He was a fool, yes, but a fool who did not deserve to die." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps not, but who then might wish him harm? Who would benefit from his death? I would not be here if I did not believe that there is something more at play here, something that you, my lord, are reluctant to share." Stanwick's eyes flickered again, but he quickly regained his composure. "I have no doubt that you are right, Poirot. I have been less than forthcoming. But, as I told you before, I did not kill Kent." Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers as he studied Stanwick. "I do not yet believe you, mon ami, but you will reveal your secrets in time. I am certain of it. For now, I must move on, but I will be watching you, Lord Stanwick, carefully." As Poirot left the study, he felt a strange satisfaction in the conversation. Lord Stanwick had not confessed, of course, but Poirot had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. The key to this case was not just finding the facts, but playing the psychological game, and Poirot was a master at it. He knew that Stanwick's carefully constructed persona would begin to crack, and when it did, Poirot would be ready. In the coming days, Poirot made his rounds, speaking with the other guests at the Rosewood Hotel and gathering fragments of information. He spoke with the hotel staff, who were just as eager to provide information as they were to avoid getting involved in the investigation. Poirot had to rely on his own powers of deduction, interpreting the smallest gestures and words as he went along. One suspect in particular caught Poirot's attention: Diana Kent, the widow of the victim. Diana was a woman of striking beauty, with an air of elegance that was unmistakable. But beneath that beauty, Poirot suspected there was a woman with something to hide. She was not forthcoming with answers, and her grief seemed more calculated than genuine. Her interactions with the other suspects were always measured, as if she were playing a role, one she had carefully perfected. Poirot arranged to meet Diana Kent in a private parlour of the hotel. She was seated when he entered, her posture regal, yet there was a certain unease in the way she held herself. She looked up at Poirot, her eyes dark with the shadows of grief, but there was a coldness to them that Poirot immediately noticed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice soft but tinged with an underlying sharpness. "I suppose you are here to question me as well?" Poirot took a seat across from her, his expression gentle, but his mind sharp as a razor. "Madam Kent, I am here to learn the truth. You must understand, I seek only to understand what happened to your husband." Diana's lips tightened, and she gave a small, controlled nod. "I understand, but I have told the authorities everything I know. I have nothing more to add." Poirot studied her for a moment, his eyes scanning her every movement. "Ah, but you See, madam, the truth is often hidden beneath the surface. I do not believe that you are as transparent as you would like to think." Diana's eyes flickered, betraying a hint of discomfort. "I do not know what you mean," she replied, her voice steady but with a touch of wariness. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "I do not believe that you loved your husband, Madame Kent, and I believe you had a very specific reason for marrying him. Tell me, did you know of his many affairs, his indiscretions?" Diana's expression did not falter, but Poirot could see the tightening of her fingers around the edges of her gloves. "I was aware of his behaviour, but that is no reason to kill him. Alistair was a fool, but I did not wish him dead." Poirot smiled faintly, sensing the tension beneath her words. "You did not wish him dead, you say, and yet you stand to gain a great deal from his passing, do you not?" Diana met his gaze evenly, but Poirot could see the slight shift in her eyes, an almost imperceptible crack in her composure. "I do not deny that I benefit from his death, but that does not make me a murderer." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, letting the tension grow between them. "No, madame, it does not. But there is more to this story, and I shall find it. Mark my words." Diana remained silent, her face a mask of composure. But Poirot could see the subtle signs of fear. Fear that she was not in control of the situation anymore. And that, Poirot knew, was the key. Diana Kent was not the only one with a motive, but she was certainly one of the most complex pieces in this puzzle. As Poirot continued his investigation, the pieces began to fall into place. But the truth still eluded him. The game was far from over, and Poirot knew that the final revelation would come when the time was right. But for now, the psychological game continued. Every conversation, every action, every look, all of it was part of the intricate dance that Poirot had to navigate, and as always, he would do so with the precision and insight of a man who understood that the mind was the ultimate battleground. Chapter 5. The Unforeseen Twist. The morning after his tense encounter with Diana Kent, Hercule Poirot sat in his private office at the Rosewood Hotel, a steaming cup of coffee resting on the desk before him. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together as he replayed the events of the previous day. The threads of the investigation were slowly weaving themselves into something coherent. Yet there was still something elusive about it all. It was as if the true answer remained hidden just beyond his reach, cloaked by the careful misdirection of the suspects. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the telephone ringing. He picked it up quickly, his sharp mind already anticipating the nature of the call. "Poirot," he answered crisply. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, it is Jappy. Here," came the voice of the British inspector. "I've got something you'll want to hear, something that might just turn this case on its head." Poirot's interest was piqued, and he sat up straighter in his chair. "Go on, mon ami. What have you discovered?" "Let's just say, Poirot, that the case isn't quite as straightforward as we thought. We've got a new development, something you might find intriguing," Japp replied cryptically. Poirot's mind was already whirring with possibilities. A new lead, a new clue. He could not afford to overlook any detail, no matter how small. "I shall meet you shortly, Japp. Where shall we rendezvous?" "Ish, the hotel," Japp answered. "I'll wait for you in the lounge." Poirot arrived at the Rosewood Hotel's lounge just over half an hour later. The grand space was filled with the muted clink of fine china, the soft rustle of newspapers, and the low murmur of polite conversation. It was a world of calm elegance, a stark contrast to the tension that had been building in Poirot's mind for days. He spotted Inspector Japp near the window, nursing a glass of brandy. "Ah, Poirot, just in time. Sit down, have a drink," Japp said, motioning to an empty chair beside him. Poirot nodded but declined the offer of a drink, his mind too focused on the investigation to indulge in such distractions. Instead, he took a seat across from Japp, his eyes fixed on the inspector's face as he prepared to hear the latest development. "I've spoken with some of the hotel staff," Japp began, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "One of them came forward with something that doesn't quite add up. A woman, an unidentified woman, was seen leaving Kent's room the night he died." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A woman? This is a new twist, Japp. Was she seen by anyone else?" "That we know of," Japp replied. "But the staff member who witnessed it is certain it was her. She entered Kent's room late in the evening, and not long after, Kent was found dead. Now, we've got a new angle, Poirot. A mysterious woman who no one knew about until now." Poirot sat back, contemplating the new information. This was unexpected. A mysterious woman. Someone outside the circle of suspects. He had been working under the assumption that the people at the hotel, those close to Kent, were the key players in this drama. But this new development shifted everything. "Tell me, more, Japp," Poirot said. "What do we know about this woman?" "Not much, I'm afraid," Japp admitted. "But we're going to find her. And I thought you'd want to know. I'll have the staff keep an eye out, and we'll go through the guest logs to see if anyone matches her description." Poirot nodded, his mind already spinning. A mysterious woman? Was she a new suspect? Or perhaps she was connected to one of the others? It was impossible to say just yet, but one thing was certain. This new revelation would shake the investigation to its core. "Merci, Japp," Poirot said. "I will start with what I know. I must speak to the others once again. This new information changes everything." Poirot's next stop was Diana Kent's suite. His earlier interview with her had only deepened the suspicion that something was amiss. Her behaviour was calculated, her grief far too controlled for a woman whose husband had just been murdered. There was a hint of something darker beneath her poised exterior, a carefully crafted persona that Poirot was determined to crack. When he arrived at her door, he was greeted by the same courteous maid who had escorted him to her room before. The maid led him through the tastefully decorated suite, where Diana was seated by the window, her posture rigid as she stared out at the sprawling gardens below. "Monsieur Poirot," Diana said without turning to face him, "I wondered when you would return. I trust you are making progress?" Poirot smiled slightly, though his eyes were keen as he studied her. "Ah, Madame Kent, progress indeed, but it seems that this case is more complicated than I first believed." Diana turned, slowly, her gaze cool and calculating. "Complicated? What do you mean?" Poirot took a step closer, his voice steady but intense. I have learned something new, madam. Something that changes everything." Diana raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Poirot? I trust you are not merely indulging in theatrics." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "A woman, an unknown woman, was seen leaving your husband's room the night he died." Diana's face betrayed no emotion, but Poirot noticed the slightest twitch of her fingers. It was subtle, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. "And who exactly was this woman, Monsieur Poirot?" Diana asked, her voice smooth but laced with tension. "That is the question, madam," Poirot replied. "But one thing is certain. She is not one of the people we have spoken with so far. She was not part of the original circle of suspects." Diana's expression hardened slightly. "I see. And you believe this woman has something to do with my husband's death?" "I do not know, madam," Poirot said carefully. "But I suspect she does. Perhaps she is the key to understanding the true motive behind this crime." Diana remained silent for a moment, her gaze flickering briefly toward the door. Poirot could sense that she was carefully weighing her next words. "I do not know who this woman is, Monsieur Poirot," she said finally, her voice edged with an unmistakable coldness. "And I certainly have no interest in assisting you in finding her. I suggest you look elsewhere for your answers." Poirot regarded her for a moment, then gave a polite nod. "Very well, madam. I shall take my leave. But be assured I will find this woman, and when I do, you will have your answers." Poirot left Diana Kent's suite with a sense of both satisfaction and unease. Her reaction had been telling, more than she realized. She was hiding something. But what did the mysterious woman hold? The key to the murder? Or was she simply another pawn in a larger game? As Poirot made his way through the hotel corridors, his thoughts returned to the other suspects. Lord Stanwick, the enigmatic lord with a hidden past, the quiet and mysterious Florence Dunn, the eager but nervous young Charles Thompson. Each one had a potential motive, but none of them seemed to fit the bill perfectly. And yet, Poirot knew that the answer was buried somewhere within their contradictions, their motives, their secrets. The next step was clear. He would need to press the suspects further, challenge their stories, and force them to reveal their true selves. But Poirot had learned over the years that the most revealing moments were often the ones when a person thought they were in control. That was when the cracks began to show. For now, Poirot's only certainty was this: the mysterious woman had changed everything. And until he found her, the case would remain an enigma, one that he was determined to solve. Chapter 6. The Game of Shadows. The days that followed Poirot's conversation with Diana Kent were filled with tension and an ever-growing sense of anticipation. With each passing hour, the investigation into the murder of Reginald Kent seemed to grow more complex. The mysterious woman who had been seen leaving Kent's room had cast a shadow over the case, and Poirot's instinct told him that this woman, whoever she was, held the key to unraveling the truth. Yet, for all his sharp observations and deductions, Poirot had little to go on beyond the whispers of the hotel staff and the faintest of clues. It was late one afternoon when Poirot received an unexpected visit. The knock on his door was light but insistent, and as Poirot opened it, he found himself face to face with Florence Dunn, the young woman who had been one of the first to be questioned about Kent's death. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously about the room. She was visibly distressed, her usual composed demeanour completely absent. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice trembling, "I need your help. There is something I must tell you, something you need to know." Poirot studied her carefully, noting the unease in her posture and the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. He gestured toward the chair at his desk, inviting her to sit. "Please, madam, speak. What is it that troubles you?" Florence hesitated before taking a seat, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "It is about the night Mr. Kent died," she began, her voice low and shaky. I lied to you when I told you that I hadn't seen anything unusual. I didn't tell you the full truth." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Continue, mademoiselle. Tell me everything." Florence took a deep breath before speaking again. "I was in the corridor that night, just outside Kent's room. I heard voices, raised voices. At first, I thought it was just an argument between him and his wife. But then I heard something else. Someone else was there. A woman. She was speaking to him in a low, urgent voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell from the tone that it wasn't a friendly conversation." Poirot leaned forward, his mind sharpening. "A woman. Was it the same woman who was seen leaving the room later that evening?" Florence nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. "Yes, I'm sure of it. I saw her briefly when she left. She was wearing a dark cloak. Her face was partially obscured, but I could see her eyes. She looked fearful, as if she were afraid of something or someone. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but now I'm terrified." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Terrified? Tell me, mademoiselle, why are you so frightened now?" Florence hesitated before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think she was the one who killed him. I think she was involved in his death. But I don't know who she is, and I don't know why she was there." Poirot's mind raced as he processed Florence's words. This was new information, vital information that could shift the entire direction of the investigation. But there was something in Florence's manner that troubled him. She seemed sincere, but was she telling him the whole truth? Was she hiding something? Poirot's instinct told him that Florence Dunn was not the innocent bystander she appeared to be. "Madame Dunn," Poirot said carefully, his voice measured. "What you have told me is valuable, but I must ask you, are you sure that you are not leaving out other details? Did you see anyone else in the corridor that night? Someone, perhaps, who might have been more directly involved with Kent's death?" Florence's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a brief moment Poirot saw a flash of something hidden beneath her composed exterior, fear, guilt, or perhaps something darker. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, there was a sudden knock at the door. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked toward the door, and he rose from his chair. The visitor was not unexpected. It was none other than Inspector Japp, who had been working tirelessly on the case with Poirot. Japp entered the room, his expression grim. "Poirot," he said, his voice low, "we've got something else to go on, something you need to see." Poirot nodded to Florence, silently asking her to wait. He motioned for Japp to follow him into the next room, where they could discuss the matter in private. Once they were alone, Japp wasted no time in revealing the new development. "It's about the woman," he said, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "We've traced her. She's a guest at the hotel, under a different name, of course. Her real identity is Charlotte Wentworth, a woman with a very interesting past. She's connected to several high-profile cases of financial fraud and some very questionable business dealings. It seems she's been hiding under the radar for years." Poirot's interest piqued. "Charlotte Wentworth, you say? This is most intriguing, Jap. Tell me more." Jap pulled out a small dossier from his coat and opened it on the table, revealing several photographs of the woman in question. The first photograph showed a younger version of Charlotte Wentworth, standing beside a well-dressed man at a gala. The second photograph was more recent, taken from a distance, showing her entering the hotel under the name Mrs. Charlotte Wentworth. "Her background is rather murky," Jap continued, "but what caught my attention was this." He handed Poirot a piece of paper with a list of names and addresses. One of the names on this list is that of Reginald Kent. The two were acquainted at some point, but we don't know the nature of their relationship. It's something we need to look into. Poirot's mind raced as he pieced the puzzle together. So, this woman, Charlotte Wentworth, is connected to Kent in some way. But what is her involvement in his death? Was she here to blackmail him? Or was there some other motive? Jap shrugged. "That's what we need to find out. She's been very careful to keep her distance from the other guests, but we've managed to track her movements." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his mind working at lightning speed. "We must speak to her immediately. She may hold the key to understanding the motive behind this crime. But we must be careful. She is clearly a woman who knows how to protect herself." The two men made their way to Charlotte Wentworth's room. Poirot's steps were measured, his mind focused on the task at hand. When they arrived, they found the door slightly ajar, as if she had been expecting them. Poirot knocked gently, his voice calm and polite. "Madame Wentworth, it is I, Hercule Poirot. May I have a moment of your time?" There was a brief silence before the door opened wider, revealing the woman who had been the subject of so much intrigue. She was tall and composed, her sharp eyes regarding Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Yes?" she asked, her voice smooth but with a hint of underlying tension. "Mademoiselle Wentworth, we must speak with you," Poirot said, his tone polite but firm. "It is about Mr. Reginald Kent. I believe you may have some information that could help us in our investigation." Charlotte's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I am not sure what you are implying, Monsieur Poirot. I have no connection to Mr. Kent's death, and I would prefer not to be dragged into this matter." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, madame, you misunderstand. I am not suggesting anything, only seeking the truth. Perhaps you are the one who can help us uncover it." There was a long pause as Charlotte stared at him, assessing whether or not to speak. Finally, she sighed and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Inside her room, the tension was palpable. Charlotte Wentworth remained standing by the window, her back to the two men. Poirot and Jap exchanged a look, and then Poirot spoke again. "Mademoiselle Wentworth, I have learned that you and Mr. Kent were acquainted. Can you tell me about the nature of your relationship?" Charlotte turned slowly, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Mr. Kent and I had a brief business arrangement years ago. Nothing more. He was not a man I cared for, nor did I trust him. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A business arrangement, that is all." "Why do you ask?" she retorted, her tone sharp. "Because, madame, I believe that Mr. Kent's death was no accident. I believe it was carefully planned, and I believe you, mademoiselle, are hiding something," Poirot said, his voice steady. Charlotte's eyes flickered for a moment, and Poirot caught a glimpse of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Whatever it was enough to convince him that she knew more than she was letting on. "I have nothing more to say," Charlotte said coldly, turning away from them. "If you wish to continue this line of questioning, you may leave now." Japp looked at Poirot, who gave a slight nod. It was clear that Charlotte Wentworth was not about to make things easy for them. But Poirot knew better than to press too hard. He would bide his time and wait for the right moment. As the two men left her room, Poirot could not shake the feeling that he had just uncovered a crucial part of the puzzle. Charlotte Wentworth was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before her secrets came to light. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Veil of Secrets. The early morning mist clung to the trees as Poirot sat at his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. The wind howled outside the window, rattling the panes with a sharp, cold whisper that seemed to echo the unease that lingered in the air. The investigation into the murder of Reginald Kent had reached a critical point, but the pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly elusive. Every clue seemed to lead to more questions, and the intricate web of secrets surrounding Kent's life was growing ever more tangled. The woman Charlotte Wentworth, once merely an enigma, had now become a central figure in the case, her involvement with Kent seemingly deeper than anyone had anticipated. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing. It was Inspector Japp, whose sombre expression told Poirot that there was more news to be uncovered. "Poirot," Japp said, entering the room and placing a file on the desk. "I think we've finally made a breakthrough." Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of his lips as he studied Japp. "What have you discovered?" Japp opened the file and began to sift through the papers. "We've managed to trace the movements of Charlotte Wentworth in the days leading up to Kent's death. It turns out she wasn't as elusive as we first thought. We found out that she had several meetings with Kent, meetings that were never recorded, never mentioned in the statements from his wife or his colleagues." Poirot's interest piqued, and he motioned for Japp to continue. "Tell me more, Japp." Japp's fingers paused over a particular document. According to this, they met at an unregistered location on the outskirts of the city. A small, secluded cottage. There are no records of these meetings in the official documents, and it appears that Kent was deliberately keeping these appointments hidden from everyone, even his closest associates. Poirot's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "A secret meeting? This is most intriguing. What else have you uncovered?" Japp flipped through the file, his eyes scanning the pages. "The woman has been in contact with a man named Gregory Darnell, an infamous figure in the world of financial manipulation. Darnell has a reputation for involvement in shady dealings, and it seems that Wentworth and Kent were working together to pull off a large-scale fraud. The timing of these meetings coincides with Kent's increasing financial troubles." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind working as he processed this new information. So, Kent was embroiled in a financial scandal. This gives us a clear motive for a possible confrontation between him and Wentworth. But why kill him, I wonder? If they were in this together, what could have gone so wrong? Japp looked up, his expression grim. That's what we need to figure out. There's one more thing, Poirot. He handed over a letter, its envelope neatly sealed, with no return address. Poirot examined the letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant and precise, a stark contrast to the chaotic nature of the investigation itself. He tore the envelope open, unfolded the paper, and read aloud, "Dear Reginald, the time has come for us to part ways. Your actions have placed us both in a perilous position, and the consequences of your continued secrecy will not be ignored. I have made arrangements for the future, and there is no turning back. You will pay the price for your greed and deception. Yours, C.W. Poirot's gaze hardened as he finished reading. He looked up at Japp, his mind churning with possibilities. C.W., the initials of Charlotte Wentworth, no doubt. This letter suggests that Kent was aware of the danger he was in, and it is clear that Wentworth felt betrayed by him. This raises a new question. Who was the real victim here? Was Kent the one who was being manipulated, or was he the one pulling the strings? Japp exhaled slowly, looking troubled. This letter makes it sound like Wentworth was threatening Kent, but there's no concrete evidence of any violent confrontation. We're still not sure about the murder weapon or the exact circumstances surrounding his death. Poirot's eyes glinted with determination. Japp, the pieces are falling into place, but we need to see this through. We must uncover everything, no matter how uncomfortable the truth may be. That afternoon, Poirot and Japp set off for the cottage where Kent and Wentworth had met. The drive was long and filled with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of the investigation pressing down on both men. As they neared the location, the landscape grew more desolate, the once thriving town now giving way to rolling hills and dense forests. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, hidden behind a thicket of trees. It was an isolated place, one that spoke of secrets that had been buried for far too long. Poirot and Japp approached the cottage cautiously, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of life or evidence. The front door was slightly ajar, as though someone had recently left in haste. Poirot motioned for Japp to stay behind as he stepped inside. The interior of the cottage was dimly lit, the smell of dust and mildew heavy in the air. Furniture was sparse, and the room appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry. A small table sat in the centre of the room, covered with papers, some of which appeared to be financial records, figures, calculations, and agreements that seemed to have been hastily scribbled down. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he examined the table. It seems that Kent and Wentworth were involved in something far larger than we first thought. This is not the work of mere chance or a passing disagreement. This was calculated, planned. Japp stepped closer, peering over Poirot's shoulder. But where is Wentworth now? Why would she leave all this behind? Poirot ran his fingers over the papers, his mind racing. I suspect, mon ami, that Charlotte Wentworth is not as far away as we believe. She has hidden her tracks well, but her desperation to cover her involvement in Kent's death may have caused her to make a fatal mistake. Suddenly, Poirot's eyes fell upon something that made his heart skip a beat. Beneath a pile of papers, partially hidden from view, was a small, ornate box. The box was made of fine wood, its surface carved with intricate designs. It was locked, the key nowhere to be found. Poirot carefully picked up the box and examined it, his mind already working on the possibilities. This box, Jap. This is no ordinary object. It is a symbol, perhaps, of the relationship between Kent and Wentworth. I believe it holds something crucial to our investigation. Jap raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Poirot's voice was low and thoughtful. I believe it contains something, perhaps a letter, a document, or even a photograph, that will reveal the true nature of their dealings, and more importantly, the motive for Kent's murder. Without hesitation, Poirot began searching the cottage for anything that might reveal the key to unlocking the box. His keen eyes scanned every corner, every drawer, and every piece of furniture. Finally, in a drawer tucked away in the corner of the room, he found what he was looking for. A small key, brass and old-fashioned, with a delicate engraving. He turned to Jap, holding up the key. It seems that our search has borne fruit. Back at Poirot's office, the two men sat in silence as Poirot carefully unlocked the box. The anticipation in the room was palpable as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a single piece of paper. It was a letter, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been handled many times before. Poirot unfolded the letter with great care and began to read aloud. Reginald, I cannot continue this charade any longer. The lies we've told, the deception we've woven, it has all come to a head. You must make a choice. Either we end this now, and I go my way, or we finish what we started. I can no longer live with the weight of our actions, and the consequences of what we've done are far more dire than you realize. I have arranged for us to meet one last time. It will be in the place we know well, the place where our partnership began. There, we will decide what to do next. But know this, Reginald, I will not be part of your games any longer. If you refuse to follow through, I will expose everything. The consequences will be devastating. Yours, C.W. Poirot set the letter down gently, his mind racing. This confirms it, Jap. Kent was on the verge of backing out of whatever arrangement he and Wentworth had made. He was trying to extricate himself from the situation, but Wentworth would not allow it. She needed him for something, and if he refused, she would expose everything. Jap's face darkened. So she threatened him, and that's when he went too far. Poirot nodded. Indeed. Charlotte Wentworth's desperation led her to murder. She had to silence Kent before he could ruin everything. But now, Jap, the question remains, where is she? And what is her ultimate plan? The investigation had taken a dark turn, and Poirot knew that the final pieces of the puzzle were still out of reach. But one thing was certain. Charlotte Wentworth was not going to let her secrets remain buried for much longer. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Past. The days had stretched into a wearying blur as Poirot and Jap continued to delve deeper into the mystery of Reginald Kent's death. The investigation had taken them to unexpected places, uncovering secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. But despite their progress, the case was not yet closed. The shadow of Charlotte Wentworth loomed larger than ever, and the final pieces of the puzzle were still scattered in the wind, just out of reach. The cottage where Kent and Wentworth had conducted their secret meetings had yielded little more than clues pointing to the murky depths of financial deceit. But one thing remained clear. Wentworth was a woman determined to protect her interests no matter the cost. Her motives were now becoming clearer, but the full extent of her involvement remained shrouded in mystery. Poirot could feel it. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something yet to be uncovered. That afternoon, Poirot sat in his office, his mind working tirelessly through the strands of evidence that had accumulated over the past week. Japp was absent, following up on some new leads, and Poirot was alone with his thoughts. He had a feeling that the answer to the case was close, but it would require all his skill to unravel the final threads. Poirot's office was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the room was filled with the scent of old paper and leather. A warm fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he pondered the clues that had thus far eluded him. The recent discovery of the letter, signed by C.W., had been a breakthrough, but it had also raised more questions. The letter spoke of an impending meeting between Kent and Wentworth, a meeting that had never been accounted for in the official timeline. But where was it to take place? What had happened during that final meeting? And most importantly, why had Wentworth been so desperate to keep Kent from backing out? Poirot's musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as he saw Japp enter the room. The inspector looked weary, his face drawn with the strain of the investigation. "Poirot," Japp said, his voice tense. "We've found something that could be crucial." Poirot's interest piqued. "Something new, Japp? Tell me." Japp placed a folder on the desk, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface. "We've traced Wentworth's movements further. She's been in contact with someone else, someone who may have a direct connection to Kent's death. We've been investigating this person, and it seems that they were involved in some way with the financial dealings that Kent and Wentworth were hiding." Poirot's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Ah, a new player in the game. Tell me more, Japp." Japp opened the folder and began to flip through the pages. "The man's name is Edmund Fletcher. He's an old acquaintance of Wentworth's, and he's been involved in several shady business deals in the past. We've tracked him down, and it turns out he was one of the people who helped Wentworth conceal some of her more dubious financial transactions." Poirot leaned forward, his fingers resting lightly on the desk. "Fletcher, you say? A man with a murky past, I presume. And what exactly was his role in this little conspiracy?" Japp's eyes flicked to the folder, his brow furrowing. He was the one who helped Wentworth cover up a series of fraudulent transactions involving Kent's company. He also played a role in hiding the money they siphoned off from the company's accounts. We believe he may have been the one who arranged the final meeting between Kent and Wentworth, the one that led to Kent's death. Poirot's mind raced. This man, Fletcher, could be the key to everything. We must find him, Japp, and see what he knows. He may hold the answers we seek. The search for Edmund Fletcher led Poirot and Japp to a small nondescript building on the edge of the city. It was a modest office, tucked away in a quiet alley, far removed from the bustle of the town's more prominent districts. As they entered, the smell of old paper and ink filled the air, and the faint sound of a ticking clock echoed in the otherwise silent space. A receptionist, her face pale and tired, looked up from behind the desk as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are looking for Edmund Fletcher," Poirot said smoothly, his voice calm and authoritative. "We have business with him." The receptionist hesitated for a moment before nodding. "He's in his office at the back. I'll let him know you're here." Poirot and Japp exchanged a glance as they followed the receptionist down a narrow hallway. At the end of the corridor was a small office, its door cracked open. Inside, a man sat at a desk, his back to the door. He was tall, with a broad-shouldered build, and his appearance suggested a man who had seen both wealth and misfortune in equal measure. His face was lined with age and stress, and his eyes were sharp, though they held a glimmer of unease when he heard the door open. "Mr. Fletcher?" Poirot inquired, his voice soft but commanding. The man looked up, startled. His eyes flicked over Poirot and Japp, and a flicker of recognition passed through his gaze. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and wary. "We are investigating the death of Reginald Kent," Poirot said, stepping forward. "We believe you have information that could help us solve the case." Fletcher's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed as though he might refuse to speak. But then, as if weighing his options, he sighed heavily and motioned for them to sit. "What do you want to know?" Fletcher asked, his voice tinged with resignation. Poirot settled into the chair across from him, his eyes never leaving Fletcher's face. "We know that you were involved in the financial dealings of Reginald Kent and Charlotte Wentworth. We also know that you played a role in concealing their transactions. What exactly were you hiding, Mr. Fletcher?" Fletcher's gaze shifted uneasily, and he ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't have a choice. Wentworth, she was very persuasive, and Kent, well, he was a fool to think he could get away with it. They were embezzling funds, stealing from Kent's own company, and I helped them cover it up. But Kent was growing suspicious. He wanted out. That's when things went wrong." Poirot's gaze hardened. So Kent was planning to expose them? Fletcher hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as though expecting someone to overhear. Yes, he was planning to go to the authorities. But Wentworth couldn't allow that. She needed him to keep quiet. He was the key to her whole scheme. And when Kent started to pull away, she had no choice. She had to silence him. Japp leaned forward, his voice firm. "You're saying Wentworth killed Kent?" Fletcher nodded, his face pale. "I'm not saying. I condone what she did, but yes. She arranged the meeting, and I'm sure she did it to make sure he would never talk. She threatened him, and when he refused to cooperate, she took matters into her own hands." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what was your role in all of this, Mr. Fletcher?" Fletcher looked away, guilt and fear etched on his face. "I was the one who helped them. I arranged the financial transactions, I laundered the money, but I didn't know it would end like this. I didn't think it would come to murder." Poirot rose from his chair, his mind racing. "You may not have known, but your actions made it possible. Now, Mr. Fletcher, It's time for you to face the consequences of your choices." Japp stepped forward, his hand reaching for his cuffs. "You're coming with us, Fletcher. You'll have a lot to explain to the authorities." Fletcher's shoulders slumped, his face a mask of defeat. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. As he was escorted out of the office, Poirot stood still, his mind turning over the revelations they had just uncovered. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the truth was becoming clearer with each passing moment. But even as they apprehended Fletcher, Poirot knew that there was still one final piece of the puzzle to place. Charlotte Wentworth was still out there, and she would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. The chase was far from over. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The tension that had settled in the air over the past few weeks now reached a boiling point. With the arrest of Edmund Fletcher, Poirot and Japp had hoped they were closer to unraveling the full extent of the web of lies and deceit that had surrounded Reginald Kent's death. Yet, even as they closed in on Charlotte Wentworth, the woman at the centre of the mystery, there remained an undeniable sense of unease. It was as if they were on the precipice of a revelation that would change everything. Poirot sat in his office, the quiet hum of the city outside barely penetrating the thick walls of his sanctuary. The investigation had come to a critical juncture. Gone were the days of tentative leads and circumstantial evidence. The truth was now within reach, and it had the sharp edge of a knife. Japp had been to the police station, finalizing the paperwork on Fletcher's arrest. But Poirot knew the case was far from over. Charlotte Wentworth had yet to be caught, and Poirot felt a creeping certainty that she would not be taken so easily. She was a woman of incredible intellect and resourcefulness, and her every move had been calculated to keep her safe from the long arm of the law. But Poirot was no stranger to such games. He had played them all his life, and now it was time to outwit his most formidable opponent. As he sat there, contemplating their next steps, the door to his office opened, and Japp entered. His face was grim, his shoulders weighed down by the burden of their unfinished business. "Poirot, we've got word on Wentworth," Japp said, his voice tight with frustration. "She's gone into hiding. We've traced her to an abandoned estate outside the city, but we don't know how much longer she'll stay there." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "An abandoned estate, you say? How convenient. She knows she's being hunted, and yet she chooses such an isolated location. Very clever of her." Japp nodded. "It's the perfect hideout. Remote, hidden away from the prying eyes of the city. But we've got men on the way to surround the place. We can't let her slip through our fingers again." Poirot stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "No, Japp, we must be careful. Charlotte Wentworth is no ordinary criminal. She will have planned for this moment, and I suspect she will not go down without a fight." Japp looked at him quizzically. "So, what do you propose?" Poirot turned, his expression resolute. "I will go to the estate myself. If she is there, I will confront her. But I will need you to stay behind, Japp, and coordinate the rest of the operation. We cannot afford to make a misstep now." Japp hesitated, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Are you sure, Poirot? You don't need to go alone. We can have backup." Poirot gave a small smile, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I have no doubt that you will handle everything perfectly, Jap. But this is something I must do myself. I will bring her in, alive, if possible, and I trust that you will see to it that no harm comes to her during the process." Jap let out a deep sigh. "All right, Poirot, but promise me you'll be careful." Poirot gave a small nod. "I promise, mon ami." The drive to the estate was long and silent, the only sounds the rhythmic hum of the car's engine, and the occasional rustle of trees outside the window. The estate was located on the outskirts of the city, a large dilapidated mansion set against a backdrop of dense forest. The place had the air of abandonment about it, as though it had once been grand, but now stood forgotten by time. Yet, despite its state of decay, there was something unsettling about it, a sense that the building was hiding secrets, much like the woman inside. Poirot sat in the back seat, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He had always prided himself on his ability to read a situation, to anticipate the moves of those who thought they could deceive him. But this time, he knew that Wentworth was different. She was not like the others he had encountered in his long career. She was calculating, a woman who had lived in the shadows for so long that she had become a master of manipulation, and now she had nowhere left to hide. As they neared the estate, Poirot felt a sense of calm wash over him. The final confrontation was at hand, and he would face it with the same cool resolve that had always guided him. The truth would come to light, and justice would be served. The car pulled up to the front of the estate, its tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Poirot stepped out, his coat fluttering slightly in the breeze, and surveyed the imposing structure before him. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant call of a bird. The mansion loomed like a dark sentinel, its windows dark and foreboding. Jap's voice came over the radio in Poirot's ear. "We've got eyes on the estate, Poirot. The perimeter is secure, but we haven't spotted Wentworth yet. Be careful." Poirot didn't respond immediately, instead taking a moment to survey the surroundings. He could feel the weight of the moment settling upon him, but he refused to let fear take hold. This was the end game. It had all led to this, understood. "Jap, I will proceed with caution," Poirot finally replied, his voice steady. He made his way toward the mansion, each step measured and deliberate. The front door was ajar, as though inviting him in. But Poirot knew better than to let his guard down. He stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The grand entrance hall stretched out before him, its once opulent fixtures now covered in grime. The silence inside the mansion was oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Poirot moved carefully, his eyes scanning the surroundings. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that Wentworth had been forced to flee. It was as if she had simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but the remnants of a life she had carefully constructed. But Poirot knew that the woman he was chasing would not leave such an obvious trail. He walked deeper into the house, each room more desolate than the last. The walls were lined with faded portraits, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned for years. Yet Poirot could not shake the feeling that he was not alone. It was then that he heard it, soft footsteps echoing through the hallway behind him. Poirot stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. Charlotte Wentworth had been expecting him. She knew he would come for her. But how long had she been waiting? And where was she now? Suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice, cold and calculating. "Well, well, Hercule Poirot," Wentworth said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I must admit, I didn't think you'd be the one to catch me. But then again, you've always had a knack for finding things others would rather keep hidden." Poirot turned slowly, his face impassive. There, standing in the doorway, was Charlotte Wentworth. She was as composed as ever, her posture straight and proud. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "You've been quite elusive, Madame Wentworth," Poirot said, his voice smooth and measured. "But it seems the game is nearly over." Wentworth's lips curled into a tight smile. "Oh, Poirot, you really think you've won? You think you can outwit me after everything I've done? You're not the first man to underestimate me." "Do not underestimate you, madam. But I do believe the truth is now within my grasp. Your secrets, your lies, they are no longer hidden." Wentworth's eyes darkened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you've uncovered everything, but there's so much more you don't know. So much more I've done, and will continue to do, to protect what's mine." Poirot took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You killed Reginald Kent, didn't you? You murdered him to protect your financial empire. But it wasn't just about money, was it? It was about power, about control." Wentworth's expression faltered just for a moment, but then she straightened, herself, her defiance returning. "Kent was a fool. He wanted to ruin everything I had worked for. He was going to expose me, ruin my life. I had no choice. He had to die." Poirot's gaze softened just for a moment. "But there were other ways, Madame Wentworth. You could have walked away, but instead you chose murder." "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice cold and unwavering, "and I would do it again." Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It is over, Madame Wentworth. You cannot escape your actions any longer. You will face justice." Wentworth's eyes narrowed, her hand moving to the pocket of her coat. For a split second, Poirot thought she might pull a weapon, but then, in a flash of motion, she turned and bolted for the door. "Stop her!" Poirot shouted into the radio, but it was too late. Wentworth had already vanished into the night, disappearing into the woods surrounding the estate. Poirot cursed under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. She had evaded capture once again. Chapter 10. The web titan's Poirot was not one to underestimate his adversaries. Yet, as he stood amidst the dimly lit corridor of the abandoned mansion, his mind was awash with thoughts of what had just transpired. Charlotte Wentworth, the woman who had eluded him and his team for so long, had slipped through his fingers once again. The fleeting image of her figure darting into the darkened woods was still vivid in his mind, like a shadow that refused to be caught. His heart pounded with the frustration of the chase, yet he could not afford the luxury of anger. It would do no good. In his line of work, every case demanded a cool head and a sharp mind. Emotions could cloud judgment. Poirot had learned that lesson early in his career, and he was not about to forget it now. The woods surrounding the mansion were dense, with an almost suffocating stillness that weighed down on the detective. The quiet rustle of the leaves was broken only by the occasional bird call, a distant echo of life amidst the shadows of trees that seemed to stretch on forever. Japp, ever the pragmatist, was already outside, coordinating a search of the immediate vicinity. His voice crackled over the radio in Poirot's ear. "Poirot, we've got teams combing the perimeter, but she could be anywhere by now. This place is enormous, and if she knows these woods like I think she does, she could be halfway across the country before we even get a solid lead." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the quiet of the estate. His mind was working, analysing every possible scenario. "I believe, mon ami, that she will not go far. She is not a woman of impulsive decisions. She is strategic, calculating. She will have a plan, and we must anticipate it." Japp's frustration was palpable over the radio. "She's a slippery one, that's for sure, but I'll have men sweep the entire area. We'll get her, Poirot. Don't worry." Poirot adjusted the collar of his coat, exhaling sharply. "Do not worry about me, Japp. You have your task. I shall handle this differently." He knew that chasing Wentworth through the woods would only play into her hands. She was not a woman who would be easily cornered or intimidated. Her actions had always been meticulously planned, and it was likely that she had anticipated their every move. The key to capturing Charlotte Wentworth was not to chase her, but to understand her. He had to think like her. Poirot had always believed that to catch a criminal, one had to understand their psychology, their motives, and the emotions driving their decisions. He paced slowly toward the estate's main hall, the grandeur of the mansion seeming to mock him. The silence was overwhelming, but Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed to find something, anything, that would give him a new lead. The house held many secrets. There had to be something that had been overlooked, something small that would lead him back to Wentworth. As he entered the grand hallway, his eyes were drawn to a large portrait that hung on the wall. It depicted a woman in the same cold, calculating pose as Wentworth, though the portrait was dated from a much earlier time. The woman in the painting bore an uncanny resemblance to Charlotte Wentworth, a striking woman with dark eyes and an expression that conveyed both power and intelligence. Poirot studied the portrait closely. The woman's posture, her intense gaze, there was something about her that suggested a woman who was used to getting what she wanted no matter the cost. The resemblance was striking. Had Wentworth seen herself in this woman, perhaps modelled herself after her? It seemed likely, for such women rarely acted without considering their image, their legacy. He moved closer to the portrait, examining the fine details of the frame. Something caught his eye, a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wood beneath the portrait. Poirot's fingers traced the line, and he pushed gently against the frame. To his surprise, it shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment behind the painting. His heart quickened as he carefully pried the compartment open. Inside, he found a stack of letters, their edges worn and yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar, and the scent of the paper was faintly musty. Poirot flipped through the letters, scanning them quickly. The messages within were clearly of great personal importance to Charlotte Wentworth. Letters discussing money, influence, and a network of contacts that stretched across the continent. There was no direct mention of the murder of Reginald Kent, but it was clear that these letters held valuable information. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he pieced together the fragments of the correspondence. "This is it," he murmured to himself. "These letters connect her to a wider network of people. They could provide the missing link between her and Kent." His mind raced. Wentworth had surrounded herself with a web of connections that extended far beyond her initial sphere of influence. These letters suggested a level of manipulation and strategic thinking that extended to political and financial arenas. She was not just a woman of wealth. She was someone who had orchestrated a vast empire of power, built on secrets and careful alliances. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but there was still much left to uncover. Poirot was confident that these letters, though important, were not the only clue to Charlotte Wentworth's true nature. Her actions had been far too deliberate. The clues she left behind were meant to lead him in specific directions, but it was the connections between them, the patterns in her behaviour, that Poirot needed to focus on. He tucked the letters into his coat and turned to leave the mansion. The night was still young, and Charlotte Wentworth would not stay hidden for long. With the letters in hand, Poirot had a newfound sense of purpose. He knew he was closing in on her. Back at his office in London, Poirot spread the letters out on his desk, each one carefully unfolded and examined. The names mentioned within the correspondence were of people high in society, individuals whose reputations were carefully guarded. There were no explicit mentions of crime or corruption, but the connections between the names suggested a powerful underground network of influence and power. Charlotte Wentworth had played her part perfectly, weaving herself into the fabric of this world without leaving a trace of evidence that could directly tie her to any wrongdoing. Poirot spent hours poring over the letters, making notes in his small notebook, but as the hours passed, the weight of the mystery began to settle in. He could feel the pressure of the case mounting, the understanding that he was on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that would shatter the illusion of Wentworth's carefully constructed life. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Japp entered, his face flushed with exhaustion. "We've got news," Japp said, holding up a piece of paper. Charlotte Wentworth was spotted last night, heading toward a small estate just outside of Dover. We believe it's her last known hideout before she disappeared for good. Poirot rose from his desk, his eyes narrowing with renewed determination. "Then we have no time to waste. We must go to Dover immediately, Japp. She will not escape again." Japp nodded, his face set with grim resolve. "I've already called in backup. We'll be there within the hour." Poirot turned to his desk, his fingers brushing the letters once more. The truth was closer than ever before. All that remained was to confront Charlotte Wentworth and bring her to justice. The web she had woven so carefully over the years was about to unravel. The drive to Dover was swift, and the air in the car was tense, filled with the weight of anticipation. As the coastline appeared in the distance, Poirot's mind was sharp and focused. Charlotte Wentworth had made a calculated move, leading him to this final confrontation. But Poirot was no fool. He would not be swayed by her tricks. This time, he would catch her. As they arrived at the small estate on the outskirts of Dover, Poirot felt a sense of foreboding. The estate was isolated, its large stone walls covered in ivy, and its windows dark, as though it had been abandoned for years. But Poirot knew better. This was no empty house. It was Charlotte Wentworth's last hiding place, and she was waiting for him. "Stay alert," Poirot whispered to Japp as they approached the front door. The door creaked open as they stepped inside, the darkness enveloping them like a shroud. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of Wentworth. Yet he could feel her presence. The house seemed to hum with her energy, as though she were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, from the shadows, came her voice, soft, deliberate, and full of defiance. "So, you found me, Poirot," Wentworth said, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "But you're too late." Poirot's heart raced, and he steeled himself for the final confrontation. The end was near. He could feel it in the air, and this time there would be no escape. Chapter 11. The Final Gambit. The tension was thick in the air, as if the very walls of the old estate had absorbed the centuries of secrets it held within its cold stone confines. Poirot stood still, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit room, his thoughts racing. There, in front of him, stood Charlotte Wentworth, the woman who had played a cat-and-mouse game with him for so long. The same woman who had so expertly manipulated the lives of others, pulling the strings of a vast network of influence and power. Yet now she was the one who was trapped. Her face, illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby chandelier, was eerily calm, her lips curling into a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. There was no panic, no sign of fear. She had always been poised, always in control, but now there was a subtle edge to her expression, as if she was weighing her next move carefully, knowing that her time was running out. Poirot, in his usual composed manner, stepped forward. He took in the room around him, the grand old furniture that seemed to sag under the weight of time, the thick, dusty curtains that had long since ceased to let in light. The house was a reflection of its owner, decaying, faded, yet still holding onto the remnants of its former grandeur. It was a place that had seen many years of secrets, and Charlotte Wentworth had chosen it as her last sanctuary. "You've come this far, Poirot," Wentworth said, her voice soft but laced with the unmistakable undertones of defiance. "But it seems you are too late. This game is over." Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to absorb her words, to analyze her tone. There was something in her voice, a hint of finality, but also a trace of something else, something that suggested she had one last card to play. He was not going to be fooled again. "You are wrong, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, his voice calm, steady. "This game has never been about winning, as you seem to believe. It has always been about truth, and now I have come to reveal it." Wentworth's smile deepened, though it held no warmth. "The truth, Poirot? You think you have the truth. What do you know of the truth?" She stepped toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "The truth is, you have no idea of the forces at play here. You think this is about one murder, about a few innocent lives destroyed. It's much larger than that. It's about power, about survival, about the future." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had suspected as much. The murder of Reginald Kent was just the tip of the iceberg, a means to an end in a much grander scheme. "Ah, I see," he said slowly. "It was never about Kent, was it? You used him, did you not, mademoiselle? He was merely a pawn in your game." Guillo's eyes flashed, but she said nothing for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she walked over to a table in the corner of the room, where a glass of wine sat untouched. "A pawn, yes," she murmured, swirling the liquid in the glass. "But also a symbol. Kent was a man with ambitions, a man who wanted more than his station allowed. He thought he could rise above his place in society, but he was wrong. He didn't understand the rules of the game." Poirot took a step closer, watching her every movement, listening intently to her words. "And what rules are those, mademoiselle?" he asked softly. Wentworth turned to face him, her gaze piercing. "The rules of power, the rules that govern those who control the world from behind the scenes, the ones who pull the strings while others dance. Kent thought he could step into our world, but he wasn't prepared for the consequences. He didn't understand what it took to survive at the top." Poirot shook his head, his voice tinged with disappointment. "You speak of survival, but what you truly speak of is manipulation, exploitation, and deceit. You have caused the suffering of many, all for the sake of your own ambition. And for what? To control others? To rise above them? To what end, mademoiselle?" Charlotte, Wentworth's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cold. "It's not about rising above them. It's about securing a future where power belongs to those who are strong enough to claim it. Kent was weak. He could not handle the pressure. I gave him the chance, but he failed." Poirot remained silent for a moment, his mind working furiously to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. He had long suspected that there was more to the case than met the eye, and now Wentworth's words confirmed it. She wasn't just a woman driven by personal greed. She was part of something much larger, a network of powerful figures whose motives stretched far beyond a simple murder. "You've been playing a dangerous game, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice steady. "And now the time has come to face the consequences of your actions." Wentworth's eyes gleamed with something resembling amusement, as though she had expected this confrontation all along. "Consequences," she repeated, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Do you honestly think I fear consequences, Poirot? I've been preparing for this day for years. You think you can bring me down with your little games of logic and deduction? You think the law will save you? You are naive." Her words stung, but Poirot remained unfazed. "The law is not the answer to everything, mademoiselle," he said quietly. "But justice is, and justice will always find its way, no matter how deeply you try to bury it." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the room. "Justice? You speak of justice as if it's a simple thing. Justice is for those who believe in it, for those who have the luxury of innocence. But people like me, we make our own justice. We bend the world to our will, and when we're finished, There is no one left to stand against us." Poirot did not flinch. He had heard this before. The delusions of those who believed themselves untouchable, above the law. He had encountered countless criminals who thought they could manipulate the system, twist the truth, and escape the consequences of their actions. But Poirot had never been fooled. He had seen through the layers of deception, and he would see through Wentworth's as well. "You misunderstand, mademoiselle," he said, his voice growing firmer. "You may have manipulated those around you for years, but the truth has a way of emerging. It is only a matter of time before your web of lies unravels, and when it does, there will be no escape for you." Her gaze hardened, and for the first time a flicker of doubt crossed her features. But it was quickly masked by the mask of confidence she had carefully constructed over the years. "And what if I told you that I had already won?" she asked, her voice low and almost taunting. "What if I told you that everything you've done, everything you've worked for, has been for nothing?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. He had expected this. She was trying to break his resolve, to make him question his certainty. But he was not so easily swayed. "That remains to be seen," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I can promise you this, mademoiselle. No matter how intricate your plans, no matter how far you've gone to cover your tracks, the truth will always come to light. And when it does, you will face the consequences. It is inevitable." For a moment there was silence between them, tense stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, with a slight smirk, Wentworth spoke again, her voice filled with an icy calmness. "You're right, Poirot," she said. "The truth will come out. But by then it will be too late." Poirot did not respond immediately. He studied her carefully, as if weighing his next words. "It is never too late, mademoiselle," he said quietly. "It is never too late for justice." As he finished speaking, the door to the room opened with a creak, and Japp appeared, his face grim. Behind him stood a few officers, their expressions a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Poirot," Japp said, his voice urgent, "we've got her. We've found the evidence that ties her to the murders, to everything. It's over." Charlotte Wentworth's face twisted into an expression of shock, but it was quickly replaced by one of cold resolve. She took a step back, her hands trembling slightly, but she did not falter. She had been cornered, but she was not yet finished. "You think you've won," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "But you've only just begun to understand the game." With those words she turned, disappearing into the shadows of the room, leaving Poirot and Japp standing in stunned silence. Chapter 12. The last riddle. Poirot stood still, his mind racing. The air around him felt dense, heavy with the unspoken tension. Charlotte Wentworth had vanished from the scene, her final words echoing in his mind. "You think you've won, but you've only just begun to understand the game." He shook his head slightly, unwilling to allow her cryptic declaration to cloud his judgment. There was no room for ambiguity now. There were only facts, only the truth, and only one thing mattered: bringing Wentworth to justice. Detective Inspector Japp entered the room with a determined step, his brow furrowed in thought. He looked at Poirot, a mixture of frustration and curiosity in his eyes. "Well, Poirot, It seems you were right all along. We've uncovered the evidence, everything. The murders, the manipulation. It all leads back to her. Poirot's gaze flicked briefly toward Japp, his expression unreadable. Yes, I am aware of the evidence, mon ami, he said quietly, his voice calm but purposeful. But this, Japp, this is not the end. It is merely the beginning. Japp raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? We've got her dead to rights now. We know what she did. We've got the evidence. This case is over. Poirot turned slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked at Japp. Ah, Japp, you are a man of logic, of reason. You believe the case is solved, but this is where you and I differ. For while you are concerned with the facts as they are presented to you, I am concerned with the truth that lies beneath those facts. Japp looked perplexed. I'm not following you, Poirot. What truth? What are you getting at? Poirot turned back toward the desk, his eyes scanning the papers strewn across it, the evidence that had led them to Wentworth's doorstep. You see, mon ami, there is something about this case that doesn't sit right with me. It's too clean, too perfect. The evidence fits together too neatly. It's almost as if it was placed there deliberately. Japp blinked, his confusion deepening. Are you saying we've been played? Not played, no, Poirot replied slowly, but manipulated. I think we're missing something crucial, something that Wentworth has carefully hidden from us. Beaudedish, out an exasperated sigh. Poirot, we've already been through everything. We've looked at the evidence, we've interrogated the witnesses, we've pieced it all together. She's guilty without a doubt. What more is there to understand? Poirot's eyes gleamed with the intensity of his thoughts. It is not always the obvious path that leads to the truth, Japp. It is the hidden one, the one where the mind is deceived into seeing what it expects rather than what is truly there. Japp ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. You're talking in riddles again, Poirot. I can't see what you're getting at. Poirot smiled faintly, the ghost of his signature knowing grin playing on his lips. Ah, but that is precisely it. The riddle, Japp. We have been solving the wrong puzzle. Before Japp could respond, Poirot turned abruptly, his gaze fixed on the door. We must find her, quickly. There is little time. Charlotte Wentworth is playing a far deeper game than we can fathom. The two men left the room together, walking with purpose through the narrow, dimly lit hallways of the estate. Poirot's mind was racing, and he could feel the weight of the puzzle pressing on him. There was a deeper motive at play, one that had eluded them until now. Wentworth was clever, calculating, and her every move had been part of a larger, more intricate plan. As they reached the staircase, Poirot paused, looking down at the carefully constructed blueprint of the case. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind them. One of the officers from the team, clearly on edge. He didn't have time for distractions, but the urgency in the officer's voice made him turn. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice tense. "We've found something. A hidden compartment in her study. You need to see it." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening slightly. "A hidden compartment, you say?" he mused. "Interesting. Lead the way." They followed the officer to a small secluded room at the back of the estate. The air in this room was stale, the walls lined with dusty bookshelves that held tomes of old legal documents and records. In the far corner, an antique desk sat, its surface cluttered with papers, pens, and a glass of whisky, untouched. The officer approached the desk cautiously, his hand pointing to a section of the wall behind it. "This wall panel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It looks like it can be moved." Poirot stepped forward, his keen eyes scanning the panel. He reached out with his gloved hand, running his fingers along the edges of the wooden panel. There was no mistaking it. A slight indentation suggested that this was not a permanent part of the wall. He pressed it gently, and the panel shifted with a quiet, almost imperceptible click. The wall slid open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of old yellowing papers, neatly stacked in a box. Poirot's heart raced. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. He pulled the box from the compartment and examined the contents. The papers were fragile, but they were clearly important. Documents detailing financial transactions, correspondence between powerful figures, and letters that spoke of covert meetings, illicit dealings, and long-held secrets. Japp peered over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he looked at the contents. "What is all this, Poirot?" Poirot's mind was already working, connecting the dots. "This is the truth," he murmured softly. "The real game she has been playing. It was never about the murders, not really. This is about power, about controlling the people who hold the levers of influence in society." The documents were evidence of a much larger conspiracy, a network of powerful individuals who had used Wentworth as a pawn in a game that spanned years, if not decades. They were using her for her knowledge, her connections, and her strategic mind. But now they had cast her aside, and she had been left to clean up the mess they had created. Poirot looked at Japp, his eyes glinting with the sharpness of his deduction. Charlotte Wentworth is not the mastermind of this operation, Japp. She is simply a cog in a much larger machine. The people she has been working with, they will stop at nothing to protect their interests, and now she has become expendable. Japp frowned, still trying to wrap his mind around the gravity of the situation. "You're saying there's a whole network behind her? But who are they? Where are they?" Poirot turned back to the compartment, his eyes scanning the letters once, again. "That, mon ami, is what we must discover. These documents are the key. They will lead us to the ones who have orchestrated all of this, the ones who thought they could stay hidden in the shadows." Japp looked at the papers, his expression darkening. "And Wentworth? What happens to her now?" Poirot's face softened, slightly, a tinge of sadness creeping into his features. "Wentworth is a victim, Japp. A victim of her own ambition, yes, but a victim nonetheless. She has been used, and now she will pay the price for it. But she will not be the only one. We will find the others, and we will bring them to justice." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their discovery settling over them. They had uncovered something far greater than they had ever imagined, something that stretched far beyond the walls of Wentworth's estate. And yet there was still much to be done. The game was far from over. The true masterminds were still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But now Poirot had the key. He had the truth, and the truth would not be hidden for long. Chapter 13. The Web unravels. The morning after the unsettling revelation of the previous night, the Grand Manor felt stifling, as though the very walls held their breath in anticipation. Hercule Poirot, his meticulous mind always moving like clockwork, was deep in thought. He sat at a small desk in the study, surrounded by notes, photographs, and personal accounts of the various players involved. The seemingly simple case had twisted itself into a labyrinth of deception, misdirection, and half-truths. As Poirot examined the photographs once more, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had taken pains to understand the relationships between the suspects, and yet every step seemed to lead him further into a shadowed corner. There was one detail that had been gnawing at him: the photograph of Margaret Ashford. It was a picture taken just days before the murder, a portrait that held more than just the simplicity of a smile. The small detail that most had overlooked now seemed like the key to understanding everything. A knock on the door interrupted his musings. "Enter," Poirot called, his voice calm and unwavering. Captain Hastings, ever the faithful companion, stepped inside. His expression was one of concern, but Poirot could see the glimmer of hope in his eyes. Hastings, though often perplexed by Poirot's methods, had come to respect his friend's ability to unearth truths others missed. "Poirot," Hastings began, his voice low, "we've made some progress, but I'm not certain how to interpret what we've learned." Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving the photographs. "Tell me what you have, mon ami." Hastings hesitated, as if unsure how to present the information. But Poirot's calm demeanour eased the tension. Hastings sat down, laying out a series of letters and notes in front of Poirot. It seems Miss Ashford had been corresponding with someone before her death, someone who had been sending her strange, cryptic messages. At first, we thought it was just the ramblings of a jilted lover, but upon closer inspection, these letters contain something far more sinister. The handwriting is neat, precise, and the language is both personal and threatening. Poirot studied the letters with a keen eye, absorbing every detail. The words were carefully chosen, not a single one out of place. The tone was deceptively innocent, yet the underlying message was clear. Someone had been following Margaret's every move. "Do you know the identity of the sender?" Poirot asked, his voice steady. Hastings shook his head. "That's the problem, Poirot. The letters are unsigned, and there's no return address. The postmark is vague, originating from a nearby town, but there's no indication of who could be behind them. We're at a dead end." Poirot sat back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "And the photograph?" he asked softly. Hastings' eyes widened. "The photograph? What did you mean?" Poirot turned the image of Margaret Ashford toward his friend. "This photograph was taken only days before her death. Look carefully, mon ami. There is something off about the way she holds herself, something in her eyes that speaks of fear. It is as if she knew something was coming. It is not the smile of someone at ease." Hastings leaned in, his brow furrowing as he studied the photograph. "I see it now. She looks apprehensive." "Exactly," Poirot said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "This is not merely a portrait. It is a clue, a silent cry for help, hidden in plain sight." A sudden realization seemed to strike Hastings. Are you suggesting that Margaret knew her killer before her death? Poirot nodded, his gaze unwavering. It is the only explanation that fits. Margaret Ashford was a woman of many secrets. She had her doubts, her fears, and she knew in her heart that she was in danger. But whom could she trust? That is the question we must answer. Hastings shifted in his seat, the weight of the case bearing down on him. So, you believe the answer lies in this photograph? The letters? The way she held herself? Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. Ah, Hastings, you are beginning to understand. These are not isolated details. They are part of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that has been carefully constructed to mislead us, but I am not easily deceived. There is a thread that runs through it all, and I will find it. Poirot stood up, his movements precise as always. He crossed the room to a nearby bookshelf, selecting a few volumes and flipping through their pages. Hastings watched as his friend studied the contents with his usual sharp focus. There is more to this than mere jealousy or romantic entanglements, Poirot muttered to himself. This is a crime of the mind, a manipulation of perception. Someone is playing a game, and we must uncover their strategy. Just then, there was another knock at the door. "Come in," Poirot said, turning his attention towards the entrance. The butler, a tall, impassive man, entered with a small tray. "A visitor, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Ashford has arrived. She requests an immediate audience with you." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Lady Ashford, you say? Very well. Please show her in." The butler nodded and exited, soon returning with Lady Ashford herself. The widow of the murdered man. Her presence was as commanding as ever. Lady Ashford's eyes were filled with a mixture of grief and resolve, and her every movement was precise, almost as though she were calculating the impact of each step. "Poirot," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I know you've been working tirelessly on this case. But there is something more you need to know, something that may change everything." Poirot motioned for her to sit, his gaze never wavering. "I am listening, madame." Lady Ashford took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the armrests of her chair. "I have been keeping a secret, one that has been eating away at me for years. My husband, Geoffrey, had a hidden life. He had affairs, yes, but there was more to it than that. I believe he was involved in something far darker." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind already working through the implications. "Go on," he urged. Lady Ashford's voice faltered for a moment, but then she continued. "There was a man, a businessman named Charles Winthrop. He and Geoffrey were close, far closer than I ever knew. I found a letter that spoke of shady dealings and underhanded tactics. Geoffrey was embroiled in something illegal, something dangerous. I confronted him about it, but he denied everything, and then he began to act strangely. I think someone threatened him." Poirot leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A threat? From whom?" Lady Ashford hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an answer. "I don't know, but Geoffrey was scared. And when I found that photograph of Margaret Ashford, I knew that it was connected to everything. She knew too much, Poirot. She had discovered something about Geoffrey's involvement with Winthrop. I think she was trying to protect me." Poirot sat in silence for a moment, absorbing her words. Everything was starting to fall into place. Geoffrey Ashford's death was no accident, and neither was Margaret Ashford's. They were the victims of a twisted game, one that had been carefully orchestrated by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the people involved. "Thank you, Lady Ashford," Poirot said quietly. "You have given me a piece of the puzzle, but there is much more to uncover. I will find the truth." As Lady Ashford rose to leave, Poirot's mind raced. He had the answers he needed, but they were only fragments. The final piece, the key to unraveling the mystery, was still hidden, and Poirot knew one thing for certain. Whoever was behind these crimes had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated him. The game was on. Chapter 14. The Mirror of Deception. The next morning, Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room of Dupré Ashford Manor, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the household one last time. Lady Ashford had revealed a crucial detail: the involvement of Charles Winthrop, a businessman of considerable influence and connections. If the widow's suspicions were correct, then Geoffrey Ashford had been tangled in more than just extramarital affairs. He had become embroiled in dangerous dealings, something that had led to his untimely demise. Poirot's mind, ever the mechanism of order and logic, was already at work. He had no doubt that the key to solving the puzzle lay in uncovering the truth behind Winthrop's involvement. But where to begin? What motives could have driven the seemingly innocent businessman to resort to murder, or worse, orchestrate a web of deceit? His thoughts were interrupted as Captain Hastings entered the room, his usual cheerful demeanour clouded by the weight of the investigation. "Poirot," Hastings began, "I've just spoken with one of the servants. It seems that Winthrop was seen leaving the estate the night of the murder. Not only that, but one of the staff members claims to have overheard a heated argument between Winthrop and Ashford just days before the crime. It's not much, but it might be worth looking into." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his mind already analysing the details. "A heated argument, you say? This could be the breakthrough we need, Hastings. Let us not waste any time. We will pay Mr. Winthrop a visit." The visit to Winthrop's estate. The journey to Winthrop's estate was a quiet one, the dense fog of the early morning lingering in the air, shrouding the landscape in an eerie silence. Poirot sat in the back of the carriage, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his mind still churning through the pieces of the puzzle. Hastings, seated across from him, gazed out the window, his expression pensive. "I don't like this, Poirot," Hastings muttered, breaking the silence. "Something about Winthrop feels off. He's too smooth, too polished. And his alibi for the night of the murder, it's too perfect." Poirot smiled faintly. "It is often the most perfect alibi that is the most suspicious, mon ami. A lie well constructed is harder to spot than an obvious one. But we shall see." When they arrived at Winthrop's estate, they were met by the businessman's assistant, a young man named Edward Graves. He led them through a series of polished hallways, the house exuding an air of wealth and power. The walls were adorned with paintings of landscapes, each more beautiful than the last, but Poirot could sense the emptiness in the air. The grandeur of the estate seemed almost like a facade, a veneer of success hiding something darker beneath. Winthrop appeared shortly after, dressed immaculately in a dark suit that matched the sombre atmosphere of the house. His features were sharp, his dark eyes betraying no emotion as he extended his hand to Poirot. "Ah, Hercule Poirot," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "I've heard much about you. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Poirot shook Winthrop's hand, firmly, his gaze unwavering. "The pleasure is mine, Monsieur Winthrop. I am here in connection with the death of Geoffrey Ashford. It seems there are questions about your relationship with him that I must ask." Winthrop's face tightened ever so slightly, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "I see. Of course, I will do whatever I can to assist in your investigation. Geoffrey was a dear friend, after all." Poirot did not return the smile. "A dear friend, you say? Then perhaps you can explain the heated argument you had with him just days before his death." Winthrop's expression faltered for a brief moment, and Poirot noticed the subtle shift in his demeanour. It was a slight twitch of the jaw, a quick tightening of the lips. "I have no idea what you're referring to," Winthrop replied, his voice betraying only the smallest hint of uncertainty. "Geoffrey and I had our differences, but we were always cordial. Perhaps you've misunderstood something." Poirot did not press the issue, instead leaning back slightly, his eyes never leaving Winthrop's face. "Perhaps, but I think you know more than you're letting on. What was it exactly that you and Monsieur Ashford argued about?" Winthrop hesitated, his eyes narrowing as though searching for the right words. "It was a trivial matter, Poirot, a disagreement about business, nothing more. Geoffrey had become involved in some unsavoury dealings, and I did not approve. But I assure you, it had no bearing on his death." Poirot's gaze remained fixed. "Business dealings, you say? And these dealings, were they connected to Margaret Ashford in any way?" Winthrop's posture stiffened imperceptibly. "I don't see how that could be relevant." But it is," Poirot insisted gently, his voice soft but filled with authority. "I believe you and Geoffrey were involved in more than just business, Monsieur Winthrop. There is something more to your relationship, something that remains hidden. I think you are both in far deeper than you are willing to admit." Winthrop's eyes flashed briefly with irritation, but he quickly regained control. "I assure you, Poirot, I had nothing to do with Margaret's death. I have an alibi for the night of the murder, and I am not the only one who can vouch for my whereabouts." Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead, he glanced toward the windows, his mind turning over the possibilities. He could feel the tension rising in the room, and he knew that he was pushing Winthrop closer to the edge. "What is it that you are hiding, Monsieur Winthrop?" Poirot asked softly, but with the precision of a scalpel. "What is it that you are afraid to reveal?" Winthrop opened his mouth as though to speak, but then hesitated. The air in the room felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Poirot's gaze never wavered, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Winthrop spoke, his voice low and filled with unease. "I think it's time you leave, Poirot. I've told you everything I know." Poirot did not flinch. "Very well," he said, standing slowly. "But remember, Monsieur Winthrop, I will uncover the truth. The truth always comes to light in the end. The web grows tighter." As Poirot and Hastings left Winthrop's estate, Poirot remained deep in thought. The businessman's reaction had been telling. There had been more to the argument with Geoffrey Ashford than Winthrop was willing to admit. The question was, what exactly had transpired between the two men, and how did it connect to the murder? "We have not found the truth yet, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice thoughtful. "But we are closer. Winthrop is hiding something, and I suspect it is tied to the photograph." Hastings, ever the loyal companion, frowned. "You still think that photograph is the key?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, the photograph of Margaret Ashford, taken days before her death, holds the answer. It speaks to her knowledge of something dark, something dangerous." The pieces were falling into place, and Poirot knew that he was closing in on the truth. But he also knew that the final confrontation would be far more dangerous than anyone realized. The true murderer was still out there, waiting for the moment to strike again. Chapter 15. The Final Confrontation. The large oak door of the drawing-room creaked open, and Hercule Poirot stepped into the room with the same meticulous precision he always exhibited. His polished shoes barely made a sound on the richly carpeted floor. He glanced about, his eyes scanning each face in the room with the same careful scrutiny that he had used throughout the investigation. Every individual had been gathered here today for one purpose: the unraveling of the affair surrounding the fatal photograph. Poirot's sharp eyes swept over the suspects one by one, as his mind whirred, his little grey cells dancing with the possibilities. Each one of them was there, waiting, perhaps in fear, perhaps in anticipation, each with something to hide. The sun had long since set, casting an eerie light over the room through the heavy curtains. The shadows seemed to stretch, lengthening as if they were watching, waiting for something to happen. But Poirot was not concerned with the atmosphere. No, he was concerned with the people who filled the space, each of them fidgeting nervously or sitting unnaturally still. In this moment, Poirot was the calm in the storm, and it was time to bring the storm to an end. "Mon ami," Poirot began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "It is time to put an end to this matter, no? You are all here for one reason. The truth must come out. There are no more distractions, no more lies. The real story is ready to be told." Detective Inspector Harlow shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flickering nervously to the other guests. Poirot had a particular fondness for the inspector, even though the man was often too quick to dismiss his psychological insights in favour of more conventional methods. But in this case, Harlow had reluctantly agreed to let Poirot take charge, trusting his unorthodox methods. "I have listened carefully to all of your statements, all of your alibis," Poirot continued, pacing slowly around the room. "There is much that is false and much that is true, but most importantly, there is something that each of you overlooked, a small detail so easily dismissed that speaks volumes. I have been observing you all, and now the time has come to put the puzzle pieces together." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that Poirot had been in control from the very beginning, unraveling, their secrets one by one, getting closer and closer to the truth. None of them had dared to suspect him until now, yet here they were, cornered and at his mercy. Poirot paused, standing at the centre of the room, his back straight as he carefully adjusted his cuffs. He turned to face them all, his expression calm but resolute. "Let us begin with the photograph," he said. "The one that started it all, you, Madame Faulkner." He gestured to the older woman seated by the fire. "Were the one to bring it into the house. You said it was a family portrait, a harmless piece of nostalgia. But it was not just any photograph. The moment I laid my eyes upon it, I knew there was something wrong." Madame Faulkner's lips quivered. She shifted nervously in her seat. The woman, once proud and composed, now looked frail, vulnerable, and guilt-ridden. That photograph was far more than a mere keepsake. Poirot continued. It was a carefully crafted lie, meant to deceive. But not just anyone would have known how to manipulate such a photograph, would they? Not just anyone would have had the nerve to alter it, to give it the appearance of something innocent, when in reality it held the key to a terrible secret. Madame Faulkner's eyes widened in horror as Poirot's words hit their mark. She had been the first suspect, but now she knew she was not the only one involved. Poirot turned his attention to the others in the room, his eyes locked with each suspect in turn, his gaze piercing and calculating. He continued, his voice steady and measured. "Now, let us examine the motives. Everyone here had a reason to be involved in the events surrounding the photograph and the murder, Mr. Carter." Poirot addressed the businessman, who sat with his arms crossed, trying to look indifferent. "You were the one who had everything to gain from the victim's death, weren't you? A man who stands to inherit a fortune, yet finds himself in a predicament where he cannot claim it openly. What better way to remove the obstacle than to destroy the man standing in your way?" Carter flinched. He had been trying so hard to maintain his composure, but Poirot's deductions had stripped him bare. His thoughts raced as he struggled to maintain his facade. Poirot continued with a deliberate pause. "But Mr. Carter is not the only one with something to hide. Miss Turner, you may appear innocent, but your actions have not gone unnoticed. The late Mr. Barrington had been your lover, and yet you denied it when questioned. Why? What were you trying to conceal?" Miss Turner, pale and trembling, had no words. She had tried to deflect suspicion, but Poirot's words had placed her squarely at the centre of the storm. The truth was now inescapable. "And let us not forget you, Sir Charles," Poirot said, turning to the elderly aristocrat who had been sitting quietly in the corner. "Your motives are less clear to the eye, but they are no less potent. You may not have been directly involved in the events, but you knew what was happening behind closed doors. The question is, why did you choose to protect someone, even when it put your own reputation at risk?" The old man's face turned crimson, his lips pressing together in a tight line. The weight of Poirot's accusation was unbearable. He had remained silent throughout the investigation, but now it was clear that he had been hiding a secret. Poirot smiled, his expression triumphant. "You see, my friends, there are no innocents here. Each of you had a part to play in this drama. Each of you had a role to conceal the truth. But the truth, as always, will come to the surface. You can no longer hide behind your lies." Poirot's gaze shifted to the man standing by the window, observing the scene with quiet interest. It was none other than Lord Greenfield, the one who had called upon Poirot in the first place. His demeanour was calm, but something in his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "You, Lord Greenfield," Poirot said, his voice lowering. "You were the one who set this whole plan into motion, weren't you? You knew exactly how to manipulate each of the players in this game, how to twist their emotions and desires to your advantage." Lord Greenfield's hand clenched at his side, and for a moment Poirot thought he might try to flee, but he did not. Instead, Lord Greenfield faced Poirot with an expression that was no longer composed, but filled with the grim acceptance of a man who knew his time had run out. Poirot stepped forward, his voice firm and final. "Lord Greenfield, you orchestrated the entire affair. You used the photograph to set the stage for a crime of passion, manipulating the others into believing that they were each responsible. But in the end, it was you who committed the murder, driven by your greed, your desire for power, and your need to control everything around you." The room fell silent. The truth hung heavy in the air, and the weight of Poirot's words struck each person like a bolt of lightning. Lord Greenfield looked at Poirot, his face paling as the detective's deductions shattered his carefully constructed lies. Poirot's gaze softened, though his voice remained firm. "You believed that you could escape the consequences of your actions, but you underestimated the power of the human mind and the persistence